Welcome to From Dissociation to Embodiment. This is a really important module for trauma work and trauma healing. So first I'm going to talk about what dissociation actually is. You might want to reflect on your own working definition of dissociation. For me, dissociation is a disconnection, a severance, a departure from certain aspects of a client's critical reality. That critical reality is often the body. That critical reality can often be the emotional body. Very commonly, it will be particular spaces in the body, such as the root space, the womb space, the heart space. That's because these are inherently emotional centers. They carry and they hold so much of our emotion. It allows the client to keep certain sensations, certain memories, certain feelings, certain experiences at bay. Dissociation is a creative defense, and a creative defense is a defense mechanism. It is supporting the current identity structure. It's supporting the current level of consciousness. So healing work is inherently about allowing and facilitating a growth in embodied consciousness. Somatic work and energetic work is very powerful to support a client to come out of dissociative tendencies and states of dissociation. So here are some characteristics of what dissociation can look like. Numbness, not being able to feel physical sensation. Disconnection from pain. It can be, it can also be an over-exaggeration of pain. It can be loss of memory, particularly childhood memories where there is often just a blank. Can be feelings of lack of sense of self, lack of connection with self. And with emotional inner world. It can create problems with the sense of being and belonging in the world, because what dissociation does is through the severance, it creates this sort of unreal bubble around a person. It's an unreal existence. It's not embodied, so it's not authentically them. It's not real. Feelings of being outside of the body, hovering outside of the body, maybe looking down upon the room or the self or the world. Creates this sense of, I'm in the world, I don't really necessarily belong in the world. I am not fully present with my world, kind of like a ghost-like quality. So things become very surface level. Things like paralysis, body paralysis, can also be loss of senses, sensory loss, sense of taste, hearing, speech. And I have worked with clients who have lost a sense or multiple senses because of trauma. And in childhood trauma, it's often the speech or the hearing. Can also be the smell and the taste. What you'll find is there will be a lot of I don't knows. I don't know. I don't know why that's there. I don't know why I feel like that. I don't know why that happened to me. I don't know. I don't know. There's lots of blanks. There's lots of unprocessed information. There's lots of unprocessed trauma. And when trauma is not processed, it will exist in the field and it will wait to be met in presence. And as long as it's not met, it will be there. And then a person just feels like they can't move in any direction too deeply because they will come up against one of these trauma structures and then they'll have to feel it. And then they'll feel all of those emotions that were not processed at the time of the trauma that are then have then become perhaps too threatening and too dangerous to revisit in the psyche. So can't bring themselves to make contact with it. And making contact is a way of saying being in full presence with something in a way that it is allowed to dissolve, it is allowed to reintegrate back into the structure, whether it's physical structure, emotional, psychological, spiritual. Dissociation often happens because of trauma, and that trauma can look like anything. It can even look like injuries. It can look like bullying. It can look like sexual abuse. It can look like neglect. Dissociation is inherently a trauma-related symptom, and you cannot work with dissociation unless you are working with trauma and doing trauma work. It's also important to mention that dissociation is a spectrum. It's not, I'm embodied, I'm not embodied. Embodiment is a journey. And we are always seeking deeper embodiment and integration. So dissociation is also a journey and a spectrum. And so what you're doing is you're supporting, through healing work and through trauma resolution, you're supporting a deeper embodiment. And therefore, when you have this in mind, you will recognize the different degrees of dissociation. I would say that most people are on the spectrum, and these people will look like ordinary, successful, operating, functional people. In the depths, they are not present, they are not there, they do not feel, they cannot feel, they are not embodied deeply. And this affects the capacity of the body and the person to self-heal. Personalization and derealization are quite extreme forms of dissociation. And I personally experienced this in my 20s when I got to the point of not being able to recognize my own reflection in the mirror. And that's an example of depersonalization. Another example was the world to me felt very unreal, very surreal, in the sense that I was partaking in risky behaviors, even things like crossing the road. It was all surreal to me. I didn't really feel like there would be a consequence if I didn't look right before I crossed the road, because I didn't feel connected to my environment. This is an example of derealization. And my final example of dissociation is the actual act of dissociating, which would happen if I was triggered into recalling or feeling a difficult memory, a painful memory for me. I would immediately leave and I would find myself in a place of peace, calm, mutedness up on the ceiling. And suddenly I would have this bird's eye view of the room and everything would go quiet. So I want you to also reflect through this course. It's a really, really important one. Reflect on your past experiences of dissociation and the extent to which you are embodied now in your truth, in your authenticity, in your somatic reality, in your environment. And maybe you can do some self-reflection and ask yourself, how more deeply embodied can I be? Where and what are my dissociative edges? Because everybody has them. No matter how embodied we are, there's always room for more. That's my main message. Research also shows that women are much more prone to dissociative tendencies and disorders. Now, I don't really like to call anything a disorder, but women inherently hold a depth of feeling and are affected disproportionately by traumatic experiences. And so you are likely to encounter in your practice as a trauma therapist and as a healer, you are likely to encounter women that need to be supported to re-embody. Why does a client dissociate? Fundamentally, client dissociates because they do not feel safe enough to be in presence with their physical body and its current sensations and movements, and with their energetic bodies, including their emotional bodies, because of the same reason. It's not safe. If you imagine for some types of clients who have experienced extreme trauma, for them to come up against the sensation that brings back some very, very deep and traumatic memories, physical sensations and emotional currents, for them to come up against that and meet that, the charge held in the nervous system and the potency of that trauma can feel so threatening that it's almost bigger than them, and it's almost destructive to their existing identity and sense of who they are. So at a subconscious level, they're going to keep this at bay. They're not going to get close to it. Why? Because it will destroy them. That's what the frequency speaks to them in that way. If you come here, I will destroy you. This is what keeps a client from being able to be present and contact these trauma imprints. And the key is the charge that's held is very potent. The charge that's held may be difficult to integrate, but once integrated, is also hugely beneficial to the energetic system because it unlocks a big potency. It unlocks a big flow within that client. And the destructive fear, the fear of being completely overwhelmed by your own feeling and emotion and trauma and particular vibration, that's very real. But at the same time, it is a destructive and a creative force, because For a client to experience radical transformation, they need to be destroyed in their existing fear-based consciousness structures. The fear-based consciousness structures are what's keeping them imprisoned, contained, terrified, ill, and in a place where they can't free themselves. So that has to be destroyed in order for them to recreate themselves. When this happens, the client accesses a higher frequency of consciousness, and the client is allowed to essentially flow in a different way, flow in different directions, expand and grow. So yes, it feels destructive and it feels threatening, and it is threatening to the existing identity of the client. The point is, when there is trauma integration at a deep level, it leads to existential consciousness shift. All needs to be integrated together in order for the client to experience, alongside the destruction, a new form of creation. Because until we recognize that we are actually being allowed something new, it will be very difficult to let go of the old structures. The clients dissociating because they do not feel safe in what they are currently experiencing, in what they are currently holding. They do not feel safe enough to feel it at the depth it needs to be felt in order for it to reintegrate, in order for the wisdom of the trauma to come forth, in order for them to be recreated. So working with dissociation is inherently about working with safety and working to re-embody your client. Your exercise is to reflect on your past experiences of dissociation and really start to understand what you were doing and what you were feeling when you were dissociated.